Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for your coming. I hope everyone can hear me well. The mic works? Okay, good. So yeah, this is the economic pluralism session or the post-growth session. And it's the second session this morning on basically economic projections, economic part of scenarios. And what the session tries to do is to address the critique of that there are no positive scenarios, basically, that also see a GDP reduction. So no, there is a green growth scenario or a sustainable SSP1 scenario, right? And that's one picture of a positive future. But it's also possible, perhaps, the speakers will talk a bit more about this, right, to do a post-growth scenario. And there have been calls for this. So I'll also quickly, after this, hand over to Jason, but just a few words. What we're going to do is we're going to have 4 presentations, going to be 10 minutes plus 5 minutes Q&A, and then after that we'll have 25 minutes left to do a discussion. So hoping to basically bring people together, because this session came about basically because on the one hand you have integrated assessment modelers, on the other hand you have a wide variety of methods and tools in ecological economy, industrial ecology, that from our perspective, from the organizer perspective, so Jason Hickel is online, Björn is here too. I'm Jarmo Kiksa, I'm at IASA here in Imperial College London. And what we wanted to do is to try to see if we can start bringing these two communities a bit closer together and see if this can inform the scenario making process and whether we can start modeling post-growth scenarios. And that can be in different ways, and we'll get to that in the discussion again. I'll hand over to Jason, who probably will pop up on the screen here for a few introductory words. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jarmo. Am I audible? Everyone can hear me, yeah? Okay, so yeah, just a few introductory words. This panel is really close to my heart, and I really regret that I cannot be there in person, but I'm excited about it nonetheless, and I know that you're in good hands with my co-organizers, and indeed with the panelists themselves. So I want to spend a few minutes just briefly discussing what this panel is about and why we think it's important. We know that we need to accomplish extremely rapid emissions reductions to have any reasonable chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. But any sane person who looks at the climate mitigation scenarios that have been reviewed by the IPCC can see clearly that there's a problem. Existing scenarios start with the assumption that all nations should continue to pursue economic growth for the rest of the century, increasing aggregate production year on year, including in rich countries, regardless of whether or not they actually need more production. Growth is an unquestioned norm and is wired into the established integrated assessment models and the SSPs, which tend to assume, as Jarmo mentioned, that even moderately slower rates of growth would be associated with social and economic instability. This is a problem because growth is projected to drive a significant increase in energy demand over the coming decades, making it much more difficult to decarbonize the economy in the short time we have left. So to reconcile growth with the Paris Agreement goals, existing scenarios have no choice but to rely on assumptions about dramatic technological change, particularly negative emissions technologies and productivity improvements, big enough to drive a strong absolute decoupling of GDP from energy use. But as we now know, scientists have raised substantial questions about the risks and limitations of negative emissions at scale and about the feasibility of absolute decoupling, warning that these approaches do not have adequate empirical support and will not be sufficient by themselves to address the crisis that we face. This puts us in an extremely bad position, but research in post-growth economics offers a promising solution. The key argument here is that high-income economies do not need more growth. Rather, they can achieve strong social outcomes and stabilize their economies without growth, and indeed with significantly less aggregate commodity production. When it comes to social outcomes, what matters is not constantly increasing aggregate production, but rather what we are producing, whether people have access to essential goods and services, and how purchasing power is distributed. Post-growth macroeconomic models show that with key policies, including universal public services, a shorter working week, a public job guarantee, and a fairer distribution of income, we can ensure employment, livelihoods, and provisioning for all at a good standard, improving people's lives, while reducing socially less necessary forms of production, and therefore reducing energy and resource use. This is exciting research, and it is potentially revolutionary when it comes to climate mitigation, because it means that we can achieve the Paris goals without having to rely so heavily on negative emissions technologies or on unfeasible rates of productivity improvement. The key principle of post-growth research is that yes, we should embrace technological change and efficiency, but we also need to embrace principles of sufficiency. This approach also helps solve another serious problem. The existing mitigation scenarios perpetuate large inequalities in energy use between the global north and the global south for the rest of the century. High levels of energy use in the global north are maintained due in large part to growthist assumptions. And to square this with the Paris targets, energy use in the global south is repressed, and their land is appropriated for biofuels to service the energy demands of northern states and firms. These scenarios are neither morally acceptable nor politically tenable, nor consistent with the equity principles established in the Paris Agreement. We might ask, why should countries in the global south accept such an inequitable future? Why should they accept a heightened risk of climate catastrophe so that wealthy countries can maintain an economic model based on overproduction and elite accumulation? We urgently need an alternative. We need just post-growth convergence scenarios where energy use in the global north declines and converges with the rest of the world at a level that is compatible with rapid decarbonization and consistent with meeting human needs at a good standard. Such futures have been modeled already over the past 2 or 3 years, but not yet at a standard or in a format that is suitable for review by the IPCC. To make this possible, we need new IAMs that are compatible with post-growth futures, or we need to modify the established IAMs to remove the growth dependency parameters. We also need new SSPs with narratives that incorporate insights from research in ecological economics and industrial ecology. This is an exciting and I think transformative opportunity. By producing post-growth scenarios and by exploring possibilities for north-south convergence and equity, modelers like you have the power to bring new ideas to the public, to policymakers, and to social movements, expanding the horizons of the thinkable and pointing the way to a feasible future for humanity that is more just and more ecological. We urgently need these scenarios to be created, reviewed, and published in time to be included in AR7 and to contribute to public debates. If after this session you and your team are inspired to contribute to this effort, and I hope you will, please feel free to get in touch with me or with any of my colleagues here if you want to discuss ideas or pursue collaboration. Together, I think we can accomplish much more than we can alone. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jarmo and to the panelists, and I look forward to the discussion that ensues. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. So a very strong call for just post-growth convergence scenarios that are consistent with human well-being, both for perhaps new IAMs and also for current IAMs. So I invite you now to come up and speak to some extent whether our current models, the current IAMs, can be tweaked in such a way or already can do some of these scenarios at the moment. Yeah. Control.
Okay, so thanks a lot for organizing this session on a very important but quite new topic for the IAM community. And so here I'll present a very preliminary and tentative study, actually inspired by the call for this session. So on assessing the capabilities and gaps of integrated SS model to model post-growth climate mitigation scenarios. So as Jason pointed out, the starting point is that established IAM mitigation scenarios actually feature continued growth in all countries, including high-income nations, and actually reconcile the climate targets with growth through either large negative emissions or high rate of decoupling between energy and GDP. So Jason already pointed out this fact. And second, there already exist some scenarios out there related, consistent with the post-growth narrative, addressing different specific issues, I would say. So, for instance, issues related to low energy demand and consistency with decent living on the one hand, or more macroeconomic-oriented assessment, but are very, very rare. So that's the second point. And so the question I would like to address here is what is the capacity of existing IAMs to quantify post-growth mitigation narratives, and what are the key remaining modeling challenges? I don't know why we cannot see everything here. Okay, so the method I use is kind of simple. I compare a representative sample of well-established IAMs and their modeling features against post-growth mitigation policy themes and narratives. Okay. So the first step is to identify the narratives. Okay, and the narratives linking to post-growth climate mitigation. And so to do so, I build on different sources, so both in the climate mitigation and post-growth literature. So you can find the sources that I use at the bottom of the slide here. And actually, based on these sources, I identified 10 main policy themes and associated narratives. So I won't go into the full details here, but if I had to summarize the overall narrative, I would say that so post-growth mitigation is about reducing and stabilizing energy and material throughput in high-income nations based on change of consumption and production patterns towards sufficiency, while at the same time improving social outcome and well-being by reducing inequalities, targeting full employment, and guaranteeing access to key public services, and all this in a stable economic system. Okay, so that would be my summary of the overall post-growth narratives. And I think an important point, at least to me, that can be discussed, is that the GDP stabilization or degrowth is not the goal per se, right? But it's a possible consequence of this that actually need to be dealt with. Okay. So first step, identify the narratives and the policy themes and narratives. And so in the second step, I took a representative sample of IAMs. Okay, and I selected actually 9 existing and well-established IAMs to have both a good coverage of structural diversity of models, and at the same time a good coverage of IPCC scenarios. Okay, so basically the list that the 9 models that I selected here cover around 60% of the IPCC scenario. And so here you can find a basic classification of the models. So the models, and I use four standard criteria. So the first one is the economic coverage, and whether the model is partial equilibrium or general equilibrium / full economy modeling, because we can include macroeconometric model here. The second criteria is the solution method, so either recursive dynamic simulation model or intertemporal optimization model. A third criteria that is quite kind of important here is the split between models that adopt a single sectoral macroeconomic approach compared to models that adopt a multi-sectoral macroeconomic perspective. And the fourth criteria is the economic theory that is used in the models, and so whether standard neoclassical approach or alternative approaches such as post-Keynesian or a hybrid of different approaches. Okay. So so based on the documentation of the model, okay, that you can find in the last column here. I try to compare the narratives with the modeling features. Okay, the model features. I'm sorry here, but I don't know why I cannot see the full slide. But anyway, I'll try to go this way. So in concrete terms, what I did is for each aspect of narrative, I tried to assess I would say, the completeness and consistency of the representation in terms of variable and mechanisms in the different models. Okay, and in my table here that I will describe a bit later, the darker the blue, the higher the level of completeness and consistency of the representation. And I also added some dotted cells here to indicate that the relevant variables can have an exogenous trend in the scenario as a feasible extension, I would say. So this is very preliminary results. It's my own interpretation of the documentation of the model. So of course it needs more discussion with the modeling team themselves to have a more robust assessment. So now in terms of the result that I found, and first of all, the energy/physical representation and inequality. And what I found is that existing IAM have a pretty good coverage of these aspects already. So starting with the material aspects, so model have a certain coverage of material issue, but have also some limits in representing, for instance, in-use stocks, okay, buildings, infrastructures, and so on. And also, they are missing some key material linkages across supply chains, which is something that needs to be improved. Second, IAM have a kind of good coverage of energy services, okay, and they are already operational in simulating sufficiency scenarios, okay, related to energy services. Basically based on and related to lifestyle changes, for instance, lifestyle change and sufficiency, and they mainly work with exogenous assumptions related to avoid and shift demand side mitigation levers. So on this aspect, they have a pretty good coverage already. Inequality as well, and we have seen during this workshop that models and IAMs can already cover both between country inequality, but also within country inequality with specific add-on modules. But the key gap in the existing model are the economy, the representation of the economy, and there is a first divide. Clear divide between a single sector and multi-sectoral macroeconomic model in the capacity to represent structural change and, for instance, shift towards low carbon and labor-intensive sectors. Okay, that's the first point. And multi-sectoral model are also able, to some extent, already to represent change of consumption patterns. But anyway, the main gap for all models is the capacity to cover alternative business models, work patterns, and financial system. And the main reason for that is that the bulk of models are based on neoclassical theory. And in the model, the agents are maximizing profit. There is full employment. Labor and capital are paid to marginal productivity, and the financial system is at best implicit in the models. There are some models that manage to capture a bit of these things, but to meet the main gap in existing model. Quick word on the well-being aspect, very quick. So the existing models, so well-being in a eudaimonic approach, okay, in terms of this criteria. So models are covering have a quite good coverage of energy services, food and health issues, for instance, but some other aspects such as increasing leisure time or appropriate education, these kind of things are kind of absent from the model. And in conclusion, I would like to provide some suggestions, so based on my preliminary study on the way forward for possible scenarios with IAM. And so first of all, maybe the simplest approach is to generate alternative GDP scenarios. So for instance, with external models such as the one Eric will present afterwards, and use it as inputs, direct inputs for IAM. And Bjorn, I think you're gonna present something on this aspect. So it's a first approach that is usable by mostly all IAMs. Okay. Second approach can be to try to update the macroeconomic modules of certain IAMs, such as by changing the type of preferences and utility function in the model. And I think Mengyu will introduce an example of this approach. Third approach can be to try to soft link existing IAMs with other models to have a better representation of certain aspects, such as material aspects, for instance, by linking with industrial ecology model, so such as multi-regional IO models, or on the microeconomic side, linking to, for instance, alternative macroeconomic models. The fourth approach can consist in trying to perform standalone integrated assessments based on multi-sectoral macroeconomic IAMs that present the main ingredients for that and maybe improving them towards ecological macroeconomics. Maybe we can talk about that later on. And final point, sorry, I'm a bit slow, but I'm a bit, yeah. So final point, maybe the best idea is to address complementary questions, so not try to address everything with the whole model, but try to address complementary questions with different models, such as material degrowth on the one hand, or sectoral issues, or more specific macroeconomic issues such as structural change, finance, or employment. And so I stop here and welcome any remarks and questions.
Okay, excellent. I couldn't have wished for a better overview, I think, to start the session with. Opening for questions. We have 2 or 3 minutes time for some questions, so I'll pass this around, I guess.
Hello, I'm Teresa from Denmark, social scientist. I think it's really interesting, I appreciate all the efforts. I don't know if things work. Is it working? Yes, it is working. So I appreciate your efforts to try to incorporate this post-growth perspective. But what I really want you to reflect upon is really how deeply different the whole approach are. I think this exercise you are doing is just how can we mix all things fit together. But I think actually you need to understand how deeply and fundamentally different this post-growth approach is. And also it's not just about whether it fits into the narratives, because I'm pretty sure that also in the modeling and the data, there's a lot of premises that doesn't fit the post-growth perspective. So it's also about revising the whole data set, and I think this task may be very big, but it's just, I really think we need to think about, if we want to incorporate this, think about how deeply different it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. But to a certain extent, so it's, how do we build on existing models? So how can we jump towards this completely change of paradigm in terms of modeling? So maybe I thought it was interesting as a first step to understand what at least the capacity to cover key variables in the model was a preliminary step towards maybe contemplating a more paradigm shift in terms of modeling. But I agree that there are some internal inconsistencies with the post-growth paradigm that we have to take a look at. But yeah, and it's not, and I didn't cover it, but I agree it's very important.
Okay, one more question, if there's any. And otherwise, thanks so much. We move on. So now we move on to one of these attempts to try to put it in one of the neoclassical approaches models. And Bjorn will tell us a bit about the results, well, very preliminary results, but the efforts of the SHAPE project here. Seems.
Yeah, it's not quite working exactly as intended with the full screen, but I think actually no, it's okay. Yeah, very warm welcome also from the organizer side, and also very happy to be a speaker here. So I will talk about two pieces of work that try to move into the direction of modeling post-growth energy in land futures, and I think they represent points 1 and 5 on Julien's list. This is joint work with many people at the Potsdam Institute, also other integrated assessment modeling groups, and most notably also with David Chen, who's here in the session, who led the work on the second part. Okay, so I will take the Sustainable Development Goals as an entry point. You all know that SDG 8 is explicitly in the Sustainable Development Agenda, decent work and economic growth. And the obvious question to ask in the context of this session is, how does it link to all the other Sustainable Development Goals? Is it required to pursue some of the other Sustainable Development Goals? You could argue that, for example, for poverty eradication in low-income countries, quite likely yes. Is it detrimental for some of the other goals? Probably also, if you think about resource consumption in high-income countries. So what that very simple picture already shows you that human development and environmental sustainability, which are maybe the kind of two core dimensions of the SDGs, might actually be different in terms of how they interact with economic growth. So what I tried to do here is to structure these two dimensions, environmental sustainability and human development, in these kind of two-dimensional spaces versus economic growth, and try to locate the existing scenarios in there. The left-hand side I actually borrowed from a paper by Otero et al., who did this for biodiversity. What you immediately notice is that in the existing SSPs, environmental sustainability is through SSP1 kind of associated with high economic growth, and there's no low or zero or perhaps even negative economic growth scenario with high environmental sustainability. And if you move to the right-hand side to human development, it's a bit similar. Also, this corner of actually positive human development with low or zero or perhaps negative economic growth is unpopulated. You can also try to locate some of the illustrative mitigations pathways from AR6 in here. So I did this for the two which I think are relevant here. One is the low demand scenario by Grubler et al., which takes the economic outlook from SSP2 and then tries to enhance environmental sustainability by lowering energy demand, but keeping the economic outlook fixed. That's why it's kind of moving upwards in this space. The other one is the shifting pathways. That's based on our own work, takes SSP1 as an entry point and tries to enhance both environmental sustainability and human development through additional policy interventions, but again, without changing the economic outlook. So I think the question that we should be asking, are scenarios in this kind of top left corner of these two spaces, are they possible? How do we build them? And that's why I'm very happy about this session. And I will talk about two related pieces of work that try to move into this corner a little bit or try to populate it. One is a post-growth sustainable development scenario that we're currently building in the context of the SHAPE project, which has come up a few times already in this conference, where we do this not just with Remind Magpie, but also with two other IAMs and one industrial ecology model. And this will be a very brief teaser, and then in the second part of the presentation, I'll talk specifically about the food system and how post-growth or degrowth and efficiency perspectives can be quantified for the food system. So let's start with point one. So for the scenario that we call resilient communities, it maybe also is a bit of a local sustainability scenario that Caspar was asking for yesterday in the plenary. In terms of its economic outlook, we took the SSP1 growth rates and modified them so that they are gradually converge to zero for high-income countries with GDP per capita above around 30,000, so that it's kind of a soft landing. And that leads to strong convergence between regions because low-income countries continue to grow. And then we actually calibrate our existing IM to match that GDP trajectory. And there's one big caveat already here, that the underlying economic model within the IM is still the same as it is, and we can discuss about that. The other drivers, energy, food, and materials, actually very much inspired by existing scenarios like the low demand scenario or the sustainable development scenario. I think you could even argue that these scenarios, existing scenarios like the low demand or our SDG scenario, are post-growth in an energy sense, in a food system sense, in a material sense. But what they haven't done so far, and what we try to add here, is really connect that explicitly to a post-growth economic outlook. So here I'm showing GDP per capita that we use as an input for the model. Blue is this resilient community scenario, and green and red in the background are the SSP1 and 2 for reference. And what you see that globally, you level off roughly at the level of current high-income countries, but what matters, of course, is the split between regions, where you see that here I took Europe as one high-income region, level off very quickly, whereas low-income countries, here I took India as an example, continue to grow and converge to roughly the same point. And we did similar quantifications, also taking this GDP trajectories as an input for energy demands, food demands, material demands, and so on, and all of that is then used in the big integrated assessment model. I can't go through all of these for time reasons, but feel free to ask. And I will just pick two sets of preliminary results that relate to these two dimensions of environmental sustainability and human development. So we can quantify the biodiversity intactness based on the land use patterns that come from the integrated assessment model. So I did this here both for a standard SSP2 mitigation scenario that's in red and for this post-growth mitigation scenario in blue. And what you can see is that there's a difference in terms of biodiversity outcomes, that the post-growth scenario fares much better. And the reason for that is because you have a strong dietary transition towards less animal products, more plant-based nutrition, and that just frees up a lot of land, which is good for biodiversity. The second bit is very much hot off the press. I worked on this on the train ride to here. So we previously worked on projecting poverty headcounts, so now I updated this to include the COVID shock. This is the reason why numbers are higher than before. And again, I compared the SSP2 standard mitigation scenario to this post-growth scenario. And you can see a substantial difference. So this is where we are in 2020. There's very little reduction in SSP2-like scenarios in this post-COVID world until 2030, and even in 2050 you would find substantial poverty headcount, whereas in this post-growth scenario you can more than half it compared to the SSP2 scenario, and essentially eradicate poverty at least by 2050, which I realize is not meeting the SDG, but is much better than current trends. There's many underlying drivers. GDP per capita is different. There's different underlying assumptions about inequality, about international transfers, about revenue redistribution. We can talk about all of these. The point that I try to make here, sometimes it's argued that you need growth for poverty eradication. And I think this shows that this is not the case. Well, at least not in the sense that you don't need global aggregate growth everywhere in order to eradicate poverty. You do need, I think that's clear, growth in low-income countries. Otherwise, meeting poverty eradication targets is pretty much impossible, but it's very different for high-income countries. So let's move on to the second piece of work. As I said, co-led by David, who's here. So here we use the MAGPIE model, which is just the land and food system part of our integrated assessment model, REMIND MAGPIE, to quantify a number of both actually degrowth and efficiency perspectives on the land use system. So I think initially we took a bit of a similar approach to Julien and actually looked at kind of post-growth narratives and see how we could reflect them in scenarios for the land and food system. And we tried then to compare to the more standard scenarios. So there's pretty much standard business as usual scenario in SSP2 baseline. There's an SSP2-based mitigation scenario where you just have emission pricing in the food system. Here we call this efficient allocation, with the underlying notion that emission pricing leads to more efficient production and reduction of emissions. Then there are three post-growth or degrowth inspired scenarios. Two of them are doing degrowth with a GDP perspective. So one, the GDP cap just shrinks GDP in high-income countries to roughly the current global average, and the GDP fair on top of that increases GDP per capita for low-income countries so that you have a convergence. Then we have one scenario which I'm going to argue is more of a qualitative or material degrowth scenario based on preference changes, so again a transition to much more plant-based nutrition. And you'll see in a moment why that's a material degrowth scenario. And last but not least, we have a scenario that combines all three of them. So then we quantified emissions from the agricultural system. You can and you should do that also for other indicators of environmental sustainability, and I expect the basic picture to look quite similar actually. So what we found is that actually if you do just this kind of GDP-based degrowth, then you're actually not doing that much to reduce emissions from the food system. Or in the GDP degrowth and redistribution or convergence scenario, you even temporarily increase emissions. And the reason is that the food system transition happens at relatively low income levels, so shrinking or reducing income in high income levels doesn't bring you back to more sustainable nutrition and more sustainable food system. On the other hand, the preference change scenario, the purple one on here, approximately halves emissions from the food system, and it's important to note that it does even more than pricing emissions in the food system. And then here the sustainable transformation scenario is, as mentioned before, a combination of these different interventions, and that leads to an emission neutral food system by the end of the century. We also quantified the material and the economic size of the food system. So on the left-hand side, you can see the material throughput in tons dry matter per capita. And interestingly, again, the kind of GDP degrowth scenario doesn't lead to a shrinking of the material size of the food system. So in that sense, it kind of fails the objective to make the food system less environmentally damaging. On the other hand, the preference change scenario, so that's underneath here the sustainable transformation, they're basically on top of each other, very much does that. So initially reducing the material footprint of the food system and then leading to a kind of stabilization. And on the right-hand side, you can see the economic size of the food system, and again you find that this preference change scenario and the combined scenario actually lead to a shrinking or stabilization of the economic size of the food system. And I think this explains, first of all, why I call this preference change scenario a material degrowth scenario, because it really enters where we want the change to happen in terms of the material size and the environmentally damaging effects of the food system. And secondly, that post-growth food system is the consequence and not the cause of a sustainable transformation of the system. And I think that's a very important point. So with this, let me wrap things up. So I've argued that the current set of climate and sustainability scenarios are essentially lacking scenarios that are positive in terms of the outlook to environmental sustainability and human development with low or perhaps even no or negative economic growth. And I think it should be really our task as modeling community to cover that kind of full option space with our scenarios. And we try to do that both with this scenario from the SHAPE scenario set, where we bring post-growth into the big IEMs, and also with this paper on food system degrowth perspectives. So sorry for running over a little bit, and I look forward to this discussion.
Okay, thanks so much. Questions? See Max? Yeah.
Thanks, Bjorn. This is really great. Just one question for clarification. You were comparing these in your first paper, the results of the post-growth or resilient community, or I don't remember how you called it, with the SSP2. Can you also make a comparison with the low demand and sustainable pathways? And the question I'm asking is, in your bidimensional sustainability versus growth, you are showing the moving upwards. I wanted to understand to what extent these results in Japan are moving upwards or also moving to the left towards changing growth assumptions. Thanks.
Yeah, I can maybe just, great question, by the way. I can just move back. So that's what you're referring to, right?
Yes, and essentially now you're also moving to the left, but then you were mostly comparing to SSP2, so I was wondering whether you could compare to also the LDSP in terms of your results. For example, poverty head counts. These were already much lower in the SP than in SSP2. How much lower are now with moving to the left as well?
Yes, it's hard to do a like-to-like comparison because when we did the modeling for the IMP-SP, that was with pre-COVID trends. But I think your point is well taken, that we should try to make this like-to-like comparison. Then there's many different dimensions that go into this. So, for example, the question what you do with the carbon pricing revenues and what you assume what the baseline inequality trends are. In that shifting pathways from the paper from last year. We took the SSP1 genies. For this new work, we took a slightly different approach where we essentially asked a more normative question: how much do you actually need to reduce inequality in order to do rapid progress towards poverty eradication targets? That's work by Ji-Hoon Min, who has a poster on this here as well. So in this more qualitative diagram, I would say these new pathways move kind of maybe sort of diagonally here, but I take your point that we should think maybe of a quantitative way of visualizing that.
Okay, on that idea, I'm sorry we don't really have time for questions now, to leave some time for discussion later. So save your questions, write them down, and definitely ask them after. Thanks, Spring. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, sure. No, it is okay. So on to Eric, already mentioned twice. Eric, your alternative economic model.
Awesome. Where is it? I think it'll pop up, right? Huh? No. I mean, it's not present on. It's not under the PowerPoint. It's not under. There it is. Kemp Appendix. Law. Open. There it is. Slowly but surely. And here we go. And maybe it will show. Yay! All right. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to tell you about a modeling exercise that I've done, in which I generated GDP trajectories where I'm targeting employment rather than growth in order to generate an SSP1 scenario. Why not growth? There is, as Jason Hickel alluded to, there's no evidence of sustained absolute decoupling of GDP from impacts. I'm not convinced it can't happen, but I've got to say, we don't see it. There's unclear evidence whether continued growth is actually necessary once you get to high incomes in terms of for social purposes, well-being purposes, and there's definitely a need to increase material consumption in low-income countries, in many low-income countries, and the absolute necessity of staying within planetary boundaries. And so this paper, first author was Jason Hickel, noted an urgent need for post-growth climate mitigation scenarios. Okay, so where do they fit? We all know this, SSPs, the narratives, we've been talking about these, the various SSPs, they inform what are called these basic elements for the SSPs. In a literal sense, you go on the EASA website, the SSP database, you download these time series. So there was a set of presentations yesterday about updating these, GDP, population, urbanization. And these are inputs to integrated assessment models. So the integrated assessment models is where a number of complex dynamics are simulated, and then they are then adjusted in order to produce the radiative forcings that correspond to the RCPs. I will say my own work mostly is on systems models where I'm looking at feedbacks and potential conflicts and so on. But that is not what I'm doing at the moment. I'm going to instead generate a GDP basic element based on a fairly streamlined scenario. Okay, so SSP1, what is it? From the narrative, the world shifts towards more inclusive development that respects environmental boundaries. That's in the text, that's how it starts off, and then there's a commentary under it saying that it constitutes a break with recent history. The focus on equity and de-emphasis of economic growth as a goal in and of itself in high-income countries leads industrialized countries to support developing countries in their development goals. And in my reading of this, and I was one of the SSP authors, it's consistent with a post-growth scenario. So I would say SSP1 can be read as a post-growth scenario, but the SSP1 marker, which was done by the image team, interpreted as a green growth scenario. And I think that could be read from this, but it is not by any means the only reading. Okay, so there are official GDP basic elements for SSP1. They were generated by teams at EASA-PIC and OECD. There are members of those teams here. The OECD ones were the ones that were used by the image team. And they have a characteristic structure. Now, some of these were more complicated. For instance, OECD model includes resource rents, and it combines energy demand with a structure like this in an overall constant elasticity of substitution production function. But basically, this is an underlying structure which combines labor and capital with a total factor productivity in order to get output, where labor is adjusted by two things. One is human capital based on formal education, and the other is a participation rate. The main driver in this model is the total factor productivity frontier growth and convergence to that frontier. And as has been pointed out several times in the course of this conference, the SSP1 trajectories for all of those teams lie above the kind of middle-of-the-road SSP2 trajectory. So from a post-growth critique approach, you'd say, and so what can you do with that? Now, what I'm going to do is focus on the participation rate, and that is something that I could do with one of the existing models. But I won't, for two reasons. First, I really want to focus on embodied technological change. If you are turning over your capital more slowly, if you're growing more slowly, you're normally turning your capital over more slowly, you are stuck with the characteristics of old capital, which might be high emitting. To capture this, I focus on embodied technological change. So this is the extreme from disembodied technological change. Actually, both are present, but I'm focusing on embodied technological change. I want to make clear that in my mind, this is not a labor-leisure trade-off if you reduce your participation in the capital-intensive sectors. It's not formal, and it's not capital-intensive, but it could be a great deal of labor. Just to kind of see how flexible the notion of GDP is, if unpaid care activities, which are really hard to do, were included in the GDP accounts, they would get a big bump. That's what happened when intangible capital was included in them. And so this is basically agnostic to, do you pay for people to work hard on things that, that aren't capital intensive or not? It's up to you. If you do, you can say your GDP is higher. This is kind of like a baseline capital intensive GDP. Second reason, I want to avoid an aggregate production function because they do not exist. And I'm sorry to, it's been known for over half a century. It's been well demonstrated. Franklin Fisher showed that the result of aggregating production functions doesn't give something except under extremely limited circumstances that you can interpret as a production function. Re-switching and reversal means you can't treat capital consistently as a factor of production. That's been known since Robinson and Sraffa's work. And the apparent empirical support is ultimately due to an accounting identity. This has been known. Phelps-Brown showed it the same year that Solow came out with his model. Sheikh showed it. Felipe and Macombi have been showing this. So I want to avoid that. What I do is I take capital investment, I keep track of it, and I multiply by a marginal labor intensity, capital productivity, and emissions intensity. And each of those have a separate frontier. Now, I do a really brain-dead the model of vintage model where I introduce a new thing with the marginal productivities and intensities and remove one a time TAW in the past. Now, TAW does adjust. It depends on some other parameters, but this makes the model somewhat unsmooth, so you'll see some bounces. So I plan to work further on it, but that's what it is right now. And then there are a number of constraints. So the whole idea is, first you've got this frontier of productivities and intensities, and then how much investment are you adding? And there are some constraints. First, there has to be positive investment. It will allow you to remove more historical capital. So the model allows for accelerated retirement. But otherwise, there's a desired participation rate, and that's the key variable. It goes way down in high-income countries, and low and medium-income countries, as they become high-income countries, adopt that as well. There's also a minimum consumption level, which I based loosely on Millward Hopkins et al., where they were looking at what is needed for a decent quality of life. It's actually a pretty good quality of life, plus the needed amount for investment. I relax it for low-income countries because they cannot currently meet this constraint. So, but then as they go up, hey, what are you doing? Okay, so here we go. So OECD, SSP2, SSP1, not the one presented yesterday, which have now changed with the new data. I did apply only the trajectory. As was pointed out in a presentation yesterday, the starting point has changed considerably. I'm using the more recent data. But you can see that my alternative SSP2 didn't tune it to the OECD one, but it came out pretty close. That's kind of like continue on. The alternate one, where I massively reduced the desired participation rate in the capital-intensive part of the economy, is right there, and I'm over time. So we have here, I did emissions, even though really what I'm supposed to do is hand it over to the IAMs at this point. I went ahead and did this calculation. CAT means Climate Action Tracker. The alternative SSP2 is going down, but it's above CAT current policies, although it matches them pretty closely at the start, which is nice. Alternative SSP1, so this is purely labor. This is purely withdrawing from the capital-intensive part of the economy, goes way down, but not to what we need for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so there is accelerated retirement and faster improvements, but still within historical limits, faster improvements in emissions intensity. And final comments, which you can read. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a brilliant, energetic presentation as always. Questions?
Yeah, I like your wriggly lines because they look more realistic, I think. Anyway, just a very quick question. Is this William?
Oh, thanks for asking. No, William is not my model. I announced this in another one. There is a new IAM on the horizon. It is Horizon 2020 funded. It's the Medea team doing a massive upgrade. It's not like Medea. And it's within limits IAM, or William with one L. And it's something to keep an eye on. They've already got technical documentation coming up, and it's pretty cool. But no, this is not an IAM. This is like the GDP basic elements in the EASA database.
Yes, I have another question. It's really like that you say that we don't need these post-growth new scenarios because we already have some. Isn't that the point you're making? So okay, so then, so what is then your point regarding post-growth scenarios?
I was trying to, no, we definitely don't have them. The existing scenarios look like this.
Yes.
Okay.
What is the latest point of where we said the coal forest can be addressed within the scenarios?
Yeah, so this is a call to make such things. I responded to the call.
And what is the answer? I didn't get it.
And so by putting in one element from a post-growth narrative, which is about engagement in capital-intensive labor, capital-intensive part of the economy. So this is just one element. As Julian showed, there's tons of different things being discussed. To address your point from earlier, this is not a deep engagement with what it means to do a post-growth world. And I was trying to say, that's what I do in the rest of my work. Try to look at power imbalances. Try to look at the role of property rights regimes, things like this, to try to understand what's necessary. This one is a policy-free scenario in which people just decide they really just downshifting everywhere in the high-income world to a very large degree in order to generate a scenario in which there is almost in which people are doing well. I mean, the actual output is well above that decent living standard plus investment. It's actually still above it. People are doing well.
I would just expect when we're in this session about pro-growth that you were a little bit more interested in understanding the criticism, the reason, the theories behind, instead of jumping to conclusions or jumping to how we can solve small things.
I had 10 minutes to present a model. I also wrote a paper in which I did refer to that literature. Sorry to disappoint.
But I guess we'll get to some of these questions later.
Okay.
So Ben, hopefully you can keep the question in, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. So far we've seen basically, we've seen the food degrowth scenario, which tries to already capture a few more things from a sectoral perspective. We've seen basically just a tweak of inputs into a few IAMs. We've seen also a tweak in an exogenous growth model, and now a different step, a tweak within the model. And I'm using the word tweak here because indeed Julian said there's much more work to be done, and we know that some of these critiques are much more fundamental. So keep the thoughts, and then we'll try to respond based on some of the tools that we have, the presentations that we had to advance some of these tools, and where to go next. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yamo. So I'll start my presentation. My name is Manueli, and I'm now a postdoc researcher from ISA, which is short for Integrated Sustainability Analysis at the University of Sydney, so from down under, isolated for 2 years. And I know I'm a new face, so just a little bit info about myself. My research is generally interdisciplinary. One of my part is doing low carbon energy system modeling from engineering point of view, and the other part of me is doing sort of integrated sustainability assessment at mostly global scales. So in the following 10 minutes, I will be talking about integrated assessment modeling of post-growth scenarios, where I will primarily showcase some of the post-growth scenarios that are generated using the message IAM. Of course, a collaborative work effort with all of the co-authors, contributions, suggestions, and inputs. And here's the overview of my presentations. I will just start with a very brief observation of the current established mitigation scenarios. And then I will be talking about how growth is embedded in the current message IAM, and then followed by some potential modifications in order to enable modeling post-growth scenarios, and then finally followed by modeling outputs and discussions. So this slide is generally trying to show that most of the currently established mitigation scenarios as reviewed by the IPCC assume a continued economic growth, and this slide is specifically from the shared social economic pathways, where clearly the trend is growing in the GDP. And then economic growth, we know it could lead to, for example, a huge increase in energy, commodity, or material consumption. And in order to really live below 1.5 degree, in order to live below 1.5 degree, current scenarios would often rely intensively on huge or dramatic or unprecedented technological change. The one example here is shown on the right-hand side, and that is the statement from Mr. John Kerry, who is the USNY, and he said in 2021 that half of the emission reduction will from future technologies. And regarding this perspective, Lawrence and Manfred have reviewed intensively in their paper and really raised the feasibility and the risks regarding those scenarios that rely on no matter big energy efficiency improvement, rapid rate of expansion of renewables, or even the large-scale deployment of negative emission technologies, especially within a shorter period of time. So here, one question naturally would be why growth is embedded in those mitigation scenarios. And this could be something relating to climate change scenario modeling, where IEMs are intensively deployed there in order to link the social, economic, or biophysical systems. So here in the following, I am going to use message as an example to show how growth is embedded there. This paper, 20 years ago, talking about sort of the modeling details of the message IAM, where it is primarily composed of an energy model, also an economic model. And energy model would compute the lowest cost energy configurations, and then economic model would incorporate the related economic feedback, such as investment, consumption decisions, etc. So why growth is embedded here could be because of the latter component, for example, where the economic model would do a certain optimization, and here the objective function is to maximize utility. So what is utility? Here on the right-hand side, it shows utility is actually in a monotonic form with respect to consumption. So in the sense that the more the consumption, the higher the utility, and that simply indicates the growth. And on top of this, another sort of factor that really enable sort of result in this growth embedded message IAM is also as a result of positive assumptions about future growing GDP. And specifically, GDP is one-time exogenous input, and it's used in order to calibrate the GDP calculated from the economic model, so that at the final convergence state, the calculated GDP and the exogenous GDP, the two would achieve a high degree of consistency between each other. So combining all those different factors, we know that growth is embedded, at least in the current message IAM. So what we are trying to do here is to make certain modifications, and one of the modifications we made is to re-examine the utility assumption in the current, we would call it a macroeconomic model. And the argument is here. So we argue that if we wanted to maximize societal well-being, it is empirically didn't follow the monotonic preference. And instead, for example, if we look at data on GPI, which refers to a genuine progress indicator, and if we look at the GDP versus GPI per capita, as shown on the left-hand side of the graph, we can see that, yes, they too did show a positive correlation, but that is when GDP reaches roughly $7K per capita, and after that peak point, the two actually show a negative correlation. So Based on those observations, some studies suggested that if we wanted to achieve a sustainable and desirable future, we need to rapidly shift our current policy away from maximizing, say, consumption, say GDP, but instead towards something like GPI or something similar. So based on all those arguments, we made certain modifications of the utility function from previously sort of the monotonic option as indicated by the green curve to some non-monotonic preferences, in the sense that we can see as the dotted curve here, in the sense that the utility would peak at a certain consumption per capita level, and after that it would decrease. So I won't bother you guys with the complicated equation to show how this curve could be described using math. So I just directly jump into our sort of modeling outputs. So this slide is by implementing what I just mentioned regarding those modifications on top of a message Australia. So this is the case for Australia. And here, we have different colors, so that represent different scenarios, and specifically at which consumption per capita level this utility function would peak. So we really range this assumption, for example, from 10K US dollar per capita to say 70K US dollar per capita in order to model a large parameter space. And here we have two sort of sub-panels. We are trying to show how consumption and GDP would develop under those different non-utility assumptions. So starting from the red curve, that is the business as usual scenario, and I took the data from the middle of road storyline of SF22, where it was projected that the Australian GDP per capita would increase from the current roughly 40K USD dollar per capita to future 120K US dollar per capita in 2100. And then based on this exogenous GDP input, so what we get regarding the GDP is exactly the same from the model because of that calibrating process. And then if we move to left, that is the consumption, and because of that monotonic utility function, so that we can see consumption per capita here follow exactly the same trend, that is almost tripled as well within this period of time. So below this red curve, there are a wide range of, I would call them medium, low, and big growing GDP scenarios. For example, if we assume the consumption per capita would peak at 70K US dollar per capita, then we can see that that is just the curve behind the red one. That on the right side panel, that GDP increase or growth rate this time has clearly slowed down from previously tripled, now less than doubled. And similar trend is for the consumption level on the left-hand side as well. And of course, if you lower such assumption, then you would be able to obtain, for example, even degrowing GDP scenarios, as indicated, for example, the bottom green curve that is representing the assumption that utility or the consumption would peak at 10K US dollar per capita. And yes, so those are sort of the simulation results we get. And just to conclude here, we show this capability based on one of the mainstream IAM's message in order to model degrowth or post-growth scenarios, or I would say technically degrowing GDP scenarios. And those are not for predictions, and instead just try to show potential range and characteristics of the alternative paths, and especially how they perform or depend intensively on, for example, the non-monotonic utility assumption as included in the model. So thank you. That is from me, and at this stage, any feedbacks, thoughts, questions, welcome. Thank you.
Great, Manu. Thanks so much. a very neat idea and bringing it again a step closer to exploring how the models respond to these pathways. Questions to Manu? Okay. Sure.
Thanks, fascinating work. Two quick questions. Can you remind me and maybe some others what the genuine progress indicator is? Does it contain environmental quality? Because then I'm not 100% sure whether it makes sense to use it in that way. And the other one was about the channel of reducing GDP. Does the model then just decide to not invest anymore or scrap existing capital stock? Or how does the reduction of GDP then work through the model?
Thank you for your question. So for the first question, I think that's gonna be a question. So I just include this definition here: a genuine progress indicator which equals GDP minus social and environmental costs. Yeah. Yeah. For the second question, that's a good question, and it's still under somehow the development of the draft that we are preparing. And for me, I'm mostly from modeler point of view. So what I did is sort of just look at the model mathematically and try to see why growth is important, embedded here. And what I observed is sort of the shrinking economy generally, because the growth rate could be sort of recalculated as well, so that generally we don't see much increase in almost all different metrics.
Thank you. Really great work. I just had one doubt whether the feedback from this model has gone back to message, and have you seen how the energy and emissions consequences worked out for this reduced GDP?
Yeah, so that's a good question that I'm currently working on. Yeah, and I think from my current observation, I didn't see the change in for example, the consumption or production level resource use. That I think is because of how the current model is sort of using the different demand variable. That is actually the question for me to the IAM community or the message to technical guys. If demand recalculated from the message, for example, will be used as input actually to recalculate the potential resource use. Because currently I don't see any change, but what I did observe is that demand is reduced.
Okay, thanks so much. We're now going to move over to the discussion session. So Manu, please come say to the front, Eric, and I believe David will take, and Julian too. Or is Björn, are you going to, or David? Or both? Yeah, come join. Take a chair and get up. And so I'll be as bold to use my position as an organizer here to ask the first question, because I think all of these are right. So they're analyses of current methods. They're steps towards a direction, but perhaps from my perspective, and maybe you agree, all of them are also to some extent unsatisfactory, right? So they're all steps towards the direction. So I'll pose an open question, and then I give it to anyone who wants to respond to that a bit already to set the scene. If we are thinking of properly introducing degrowth, post-growth literature, you need a better understanding of global north, global south relations, right? You need a better understanding of redistributions, of labor, of an economic restructuring that has the detail where you can see which part of the economy are useful in a sense and contribute to well-being and which are not. And also perhaps describing being able to describe changes in national and international power structures or institutions. So many of these parts are an integral part, right, of the question of how and of the question of illustrating these changes towards such pathways. To what extent, and for everyone who wants to then afterwards also engage in this, to what extent do we have some tools that could go there, or what do we need to some extent to take that up? Some parts might be narrative, some parts might be modeling. I'm wondering whether anyone wants to share some thoughts on this. Yeah. Okay.
So I just mentioned part of me is doing the so-called input-output analysis, the top-down economic model, and we look at sustainability impacts at different scales. And we are really hoping to really combine the two communities together, because I think that's the reason why I'm the new face here. So we wish to do for me, modeler guy, so I would often see the opportunity to combine the different modeling techniques together and to answer questions from different perspectives, especially for input analysis. It's good to look at hidden supply chain impact, and I think that is not really at least explicitly included in the current message I am. So yeah, that's for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I can just add two incomplete bits. One important dimension is inequality, and that we try to capture to at least a certain way, often restricted to income inequality. There are many other important dimensions. So that represents, I guess, or at least correlates with power structures within countries. And then same applies to, I guess, distributional questions, equity questions, burden sharing questions between countries, which are also tightly related to the power sharing, to the power questions. Apart from that, there was a session on integrating political institutions in IAMs, which unfortunately overlapped with the other economic session this morning. So maybe we could have learned something about that aspect there as well.
There's a long-standing debate in these global climate scenario processes about the wisdom of top-down versus bottom-up. I think we really haven't done enough for bottom-up, and there's two things. One of them is what is happening in countries and what plans are present in countries and below, but another one is what evidence is there of alternative ways of living? And there are many examples to look at and different ways to structure how we produce and consume. Most of those are not at scale, and so that's a challenge. But it's not a unique challenge. There are many cases where you're trying to understand what the future might hold, where the only examples you have would have to be scaled up, but they have not been done at scale. At that point, you got to ask the modelers. Sorry, we keep coming back, the modelers, but yeah. But it is a way to do it. Is some simulation.
Yeah, maybe I can jump to what you said to suggest maybe in terms of methodological approach, how can we do? Maybe there is complementary approaches. So first, starting with GDP assumptions, because to some extent we are stuck to that, but maybe start. First approach would be to develop alternative GDP assumptions and derive implications for well-being and so on, energy and so on. But maybe we can also work the other way around. Start with the real objectives, which are first the decreasing material and energy output, while at the same time improving social outcome. And then we try, as in a bottom-up fashion to some extent, to try to understand what's the content of the economic systems consistent with this pathway, and maybe use multi-sectoral approaches of macroeconomic modeling to try to understand what does it mean in terms of output for different sectors, where do people work, get income from, how do they consume, what their consumption patterns, and try to rebuild a vision of the economic system consistent with the objective to reduce material throughput and guaranteeing well-being for all. So maybe there is complementary approach. So starting from GDP assumption or the other way around. So that's my proposal.
Yeah, right. I mean, so you mentioned, of course, there's a whole degrowth world is something that is, if we also look into the degrowth literature, it's so broad and draws from ecological feminism, it draws from neo-colonial theory. There's just a lot. But I think what looking through the literature was the most relevant, especially for the IAM world, is one is getting away from GDP as the unique indicator of welfare and trying to look at, so for the food system it's a bit easier because we can look at nutrition and human well-being that way. And the other aspect is tied into that, so what does well-being mean? And then we have all the already in more or less nascent form low energy demand and lower demand scenarios, and we bring these together, then I think we are getting a bit closer towards at least what the models are really good at doing in a, so to say, degrowth way.
Thanks so much. Questions, and I'll open up to especially those that didn't have the chance to ask. So.
Thank you. Shin Asayama from Nice, Japan. So I have a question to Björn. So I'm glad to see that you're working on those things, but I'm just wondering about so you constructed the resilience community scenario, which is assuming no economic growth in developed countries, but continued economic growth in low-income countries, and then there's global convergence of the economic levels. And then compared to the SSP1, SSP2, and from modeling perspective, that's understandable. But I'm not a modelist, I'm a social scientist, so maybe this is a bit silly question, but I feel like, from policy concerns, to compare to this scenario, to not do the SSP1 or SSP2, but SSP4 inequality scenario, that might be more interesting, because what we want to avoid is not if we can achieve resilience in community scenario, that would be great, that would be fine, that would be really good. But what we want to avoid is to no growth in high income countries, but continued inequality and no growth in low income countries. So how we can avoiding and shifting from this degrowth scenario to SSP4. So I'm not sure this is a right question to answer that, but I just want to hear what you're thought about. Thanks.
Okay. There's not much. I can run around.
Thanks, that's a great question. I take the point when I do this next time to put more SSPs in the background. And I think, especially in a post-COVID world, maybe your question has even more of a relevance. One way you can maybe think about the effect of COVID on the SSPs is that it shifted the baseline from SSP2 to SSP4, because high-income countries have the resources to launch these huge economic bailout or whatever you might call them packages, whereas low-income countries might not. We probably have to wait a few years to see how that plays out, but I think that's not so unrealistic option that maybe a post-COVID baseline looks more like SSP4 than like SSP2. And then, the question how to shift from there to the kind of optimistic post-growth scenario that we try to model, that's a very tricky one. So I think I have to reflect on that more.
Thank you. Tommy Wiedmann, University of New South Wales. I was wondering whether we can get any sense about the speed at which degrowth could happen. Might have been a question to Jason, but I understand he's not online. But maybe Rick or Julia, maybe you have a sense about that. So when we think about technological change, we can get a sense of how quickly we can build new power stations, for example. Even economically, I think we can estimate how much capital might be available to finance new technology or new infrastructure. But with degrowth, to me, that appears to be inherently difficult because it's a political thing, obviously. Does it take generations to get into new thinking? Does it just take a couple of electoral cycles? I don't know whether there's any way we could include that into some narrative. So if we think about SSP1, do we have a sense whether this is more longer term and maybe cannot happen within the next 10 years? Maybe there's no way it can happen, or do we have any sense about speed? That would be my question.
So I think Jason can be miraculously put on the screen, so I'll give him the chance to respond. Maybe my first intuition would be maybe something with unequal value exchange, but I'll leave to Jason.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure that we've given that enough thought. But a few things to consider is, first of all, the question of political feasibility is an important one, I think. But we also have quite a lot of data now showing that there are strong public preferences for several key degrowth policies, and with large majority support, so 60 to 70% in the surveys of high-income countries that we've looked at. So this suggests to me that there's a lot of possibility for rapid political change. It's really a question of how decisions about economic production and policy are controlled and determined. Right now, of course, in a capitalist system, decisions about what to produce and how to use resources and energy, of course, are controlled by the 1% of people who own the majority of shares and determine the election of directors of major firms, right? So it's a rather oligarchic or plutocratic system, not very democratic. And so it really depends on the quality of our democracies to enable the kind of transition that people actually want to see in the economy, which is a focus less on capital accumulation and constant expansion and more on human well-being and ecological objectives. So it depends on the conditions. And so what I would say, I suppose, is when we write narratives about this, let's think about the democratic element of this. I think that would determine the speed of transition. I just very briefly also want to say something about GDP degrowth. This also has not received enough attention, I think, in the descriptive literature. So when you see GDP per capita declining to, say, 20 or 30,000, that may seem quite jarring for people in high-income nations. But I think it's important to understand what exactly this represents, right? People often ask me, will there be enough income in a degrowth scenario to live a decent life or a good life? And the answer is, by definition, yes. Simply because we have to understand what GDP measures. GDP is simply, national income is simply the obverse of all of the prices of the products that are produced in the economy every year. There's always, by definition, enough income to buy everything the economy produces. So as long as we agree and are insistent on the fact that we're producing what people require to meet their needs at a good standard, there's always, by definition, enough income to buy those things, because these are accounting equivalencies. So if you take the transport sector, for example, we know that public transit costs half as much as private transit per passenger mile. And so if we were to switch from private transit to public transit, then GDP in the transport sector would decline by half. That seems jarring until you realize that, well, we actually need less income to buy the public transit because it's cheaper now, because it requires less production of us effectively. So I think that we don't have to worry about that too much, and actually part of our messaging as well, that what matters here is what we're producing, how income is distributed, and whether people have access to the livelihood that they need, that they require, rather than GDP itself. So this should be part of our narrative, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll take two more questions here, because otherwise we'll eat a bit too much into our lunch break, I'm afraid. There we go.
Thanks a lot. Tabia Lisna, Climate Analytics. Thanks a lot for these really, really interesting and absolutely relevant discussions. I've followed much more, or a lot of the discussions also about including impacts and adaptation in integrated assessment models. And maybe it's more of a comment rather than a question, because it would be a very long discussion about this as well. But I think the post-growth dimension, a lot of the aspects that we've discussed, especially in terms of better reflecting well-being dimensions, maybe also in IAMs, I think are really relevant also to bring that together, because I guess philosophically almost adaptation just addresses much more than only GDP outcomes. And I'd be really interested, well, to hear perspectives on this, but also maybe just to continue that discussion over lunch to really see how that can be brought together.
Okay, thanks. I'll take the second question too.
Oliver Gieden, German Institute for International Security Affairs, and coming from the CDR community, referring to what Jason said in the beginning, but what also Björn showed about shifting diets and GDP. It seems to me that much of the CDR demand comes from residual non-CO2 emissions throughout the century. And I want to highlight that in the LED scenario, it lands at almost 5 gigatons of sequestration through land by 2100. That has been a little bit underreported in the SR 1.5 because these were net numbers. So while they don't use BECS or DACs, it's quite a lot CDR, and I wouldn't say that it is as such more realistic to do 5 gigatons per year with afforestation. But I wonder, referring to Björn, is that, is it mainly a function of residual non-CO2 emissions and not exactly GDP? And is it mainly a function of the residual emissions we have to talk about, which may not be a result of high GDP, but actually the way how we run our economies or about the consumption patterns?
Okay, thanks. So a question on more integrated scenarios, integrated perspectives, and on net zero economy. Who wants to?
That is well, first, on bringing in adaptation, adaptive responses, absolutely. I think that's crucial. Actually, both these questions got to attention in this whole scenario effort, which is the analytical separation between the narratives and then the economic drivers and then the systems. That's proven useful, but we miss all these integrated stories. So it might be people from within this community, but not necessarily generating these scenarios. But there's so what do you aim for? Do you aim for the ones that are part of this SSP? IAM RCP combination, or do you aim to do a study that will get cited in the IPCC reports? And I think that kind of integrated study is critical in both cases.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to the second question on CDR. So I think there's two factors that determine the demand for CDR in mitigation scenarios. One is how rapidly we decarbonize the energy system, and the second one that you referred to is also important to compensate the residual non-CO2 emissions. If you think about the low energy demand scenario, that decarbonizes the energy system very quickly, and it's easier to do so because of the so low energy demand. And if you have similarly ambitious assumptions about dietary change, then you free up a lot of land area, which allows for a much larger afforestation. Whether the 5 gigatons are realistic or not, I think that's a more tricky question, but these two are important to consider. So in a sense, yes, the amount of CDR we need is more a function of the land system and the food system. But I think what we were able to show also in our MAGPIE study, that ultimately what the land system looks like and what the energy system looks like, that in turn has implications for our economic system. So that's of course only a partial coverage, but if the food system changes so dramatically, then the economic size of the food system changes dramatically. And equally, if the energy system changes so dramatically, shifting towards a low demand world, then I think our entire economic system shifts as well. And that's something that the low energy demand scenario doesn't consider. And so I think that link to go from the land system and the energy system and what that means for GDP, I think that's the important thing that we need to get into the models.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm afraid that we can't take more questions and need to wrap up because it's lunchtime. But as was already said in the beginning, this is a relatively new field for the integrated assessment modeling community. I think illustrated to some extent basically that they were not explicitly included in the SSP framework. So I'm hoping that this session will serve as a kickoff, as an invitation to engage more with this topic. And we've heard we need many different communities to help out in constructing such scenarios, to provide both the insights of what key elements do we need, what key themes do we need to get into these scenarios, as well as what are the tools that are available to make some quantification here, such that the models that are at the moment only a few, to some extent, can model it, but are generally not so able yet to do it, or the interpretation, if you want to do it in a tweak way, the interpretation will be difficult.
So again, I extend the invitation also by Jason. So Jason and Björn also thanks for helping organize, and the presenters all, thanks so much. I hope you stay around a bit more for if people have a few more questions. Otherwise, shoot an email, start the conversation, and very happy to engage. Thanks so much.